Okay, so now that we've covered the causes of the Civil War, everything that built up to it in the 30 years beforehand, now we're going to cover the actual events of the Civil War. So you've got your major leaders of the Civil War: Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Ulysses S. Grant. Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States from 1861 to 1865. He was a Republican. The southern states were afraid that Lincoln would get rid of slavery. Lincoln believed that secession was illegal, that they weren't allowed to do it, and he was very willing to use force to preserve the Union. Jefferson Davis was the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. He was a West Point graduate, which means he was educated by the U.S. military, and he was also a former senator from Mississippi. He didn't want to be president. He was not a good politician. He was very reluctant about it. He's not good at compromising, and he doesn't handle criticism well. If you look at all the politicians that we have today, they're all highly criticized by everybody, both good and bad. So, can you imagine being president of the Confederacy, a place that most of the country didn't think was legitimate, and you're president of it and you can't handle criticism? So, Jefferson Davis was a little stressed out, to say the least. Robert E. Lee was commander of the Confederate forces. He opposed secession, but he did not believe that the Union should be held together by force. He believed that the Union should be able to do whatever they wanted to do. So when Virginia left the Union, Lee accepted the command of the Confederate Army. Now, Lee was tapped to be the Union Army general, but when Virginia seceded, he said, I'm going to go with my state. So think back to the founding fathers and like Jefferson and Washington. They were like, yeah, we're Virginians before they're United States citizens. So this mentality still existed where your state was more important than the United States. And you weren't going to go fight against your state or your family that lived with you in your state. After the war, Lee accepted defeat and he encouraged the Americans to reunite and stop fighting. Ulysses S. Grant was the last of the Union commanders. So we had three major commanders before Grant. We had Scott, who was July of 1841 to November of 1861. He was very elderly, very cautious, and led to a lot of issues. McClellan was leader from November of 1861 to March 1862. Again, not a very long tenure. He was a good organizer, but he had a lot of excuses for not engaging, and President Lincoln got ticked off about that. Then you have Halleck, who was July of 1862 to March of 1864. He was very disorganized. During this time period, the Union was facing a lot of losses. The Confederacy was actually winning. So you can imagine how much that ticked Lincoln off. And finally, Grant came in, and he was the Union commander from March of 1864 to March of 1865. So that helped quite a bit. War strategy. So the Confederacy was always on the defensive. They're the ones that left, so they felt that they had to defend their position. The Union, on the other hand, stayed on the offensive. Their main goal was known as the Anaconda Plan, which means snake around the Confederacy, follow along the outside, like sail around the outside and get to the Mississippi, and then cut them off at the head, which was the Mississippi. So part of this plan was to capture Richmond, which was the Confederate capital, blockade the South with the Navy, and split the Confederacy along the Mississippi River. Blockading the South with the Navy meant that they couldn't get any manufactured goods into the South. Remember, the South is largely agricultural, so they ship their stuff out and they ship in manufactured goods. If they're blockaded, they can't do any of that. So Lincoln's inaugural address. The North would not invade the South, but it would defend federal property. So any U.S. fort or base, that's considered federal property. So Fort Sumter, that's federal property located in South Carolina, right outside Charleston. So the opening engagement was April 12th to the 14th, 1861. The Confederacy demanded that the Union give over and surrender Fort Sumter. Lincoln tried to supply the fort, but he faced an ultimatum and they surrendered. The Union lost Fort Sumter after a 34-hour siege. So the Confederate States of America that seceded from the Union before Fort Sumter were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Following Fort Sumter, so following April 15th, North Carolina, Arkansas, Virginia, and Tennessee all left the Union. And now you've also got your border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, West Virginia, and Missouri. Those are slave states that didn't want to leave the Union. So the benefits of the border states, their population increased the northern population numbers. They had military supplies, so they were able to provide necessary supplies like food, animals, and minerals to the military, so the U.S. military. Railroad lines. They had essential railroad lines that helped move all of these supplies through the northern states. So if you look at the map, you've got your border states, which are the ones in gray above the purple line, and then the Union is the blue. The First Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, both sides expected this to be a quick victory. In fact, much of Washington, D.C. brought out picnic baskets and came to watch. They thought it was going to be just a nice little thing to watch out in the middle of July. Reality, it was a bloody and confused battle, which ended in a Confederate victory. It was very nasty. Thomas Stonewall Jackson, so he was Lee's right-hand man. There basically wasn't anything that Jackson could not do. He was known as Stonewall because there was a quote, "There's Jackson standing like a stone wall." Nobody got past him. He was a bad dude. He shot his own men by mistake at night when walking near the lines of battle. He was a bad dude, yeah. Wake up call. So the war would not be over by Christmas, which everybody in the North thought would happen. Like they were like, this is going to be over quickly. This is going to be done. It's not going to be a big deal. But no, it continued on. So Lincoln ended up having to call for 1 million troops to serve for 3 years. So the very first years of the war were a disaster for the Union. The Eastern Theater was known as Northern Virginia, so where we are now, and the Western Theater was around the Mississippi River. In the Eastern Theater, the Union was outmaneuvered and outsoldiered by an experienced and knowledgeable military. The Union just kept losing one battle after another. In the Western Theater, Ulysses S. Grant and William Sherman were winning. So the Union was winning in the West, but the Confederacy was winning in the East. The slavery issue. So Frederick Douglass, he was a former slave and he was self-educated. He kept urging Abraham Lincoln to recruit former slaves into the Union Army. He met with him multiple times and saying, look, recruit, recruit, recruit. Finally, in 1862, Lincoln listened. Congress passed an act that allowed African Americans to serve in the Union Army. The initial enlistment was very slow, And there was no guarantee that Lincoln would end slavery forever. So that's why people were like, we're going to hold off and see what happens. So Lincoln's opinions on slavery: he would not free the slaves if it hurt the war effort. And prejudice was still very strong in the North. So just because they weren't slave states didn't mean they weren't anti-African Americans. So that's why it became a huge issue in the North still too. So Lincoln said, if I could save the Union without freeing a slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all of the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Lincoln was very divided on how to handle it because he didn't want to make the wrong step. The country was already divided. He didn't want to do anything else that might be considered wrong. So at the Battle of Antietam, it was the bloodiest single day of the Civil War. It was catastrophic. Over 22,000 people died in one day of battle. The majority of the losses were Union, but it was basically even between Union and Confederate. It was an absolutely catastrophic day. It was in Antietam, Maryland, which is just an hour north of here. And because of high casualties on both sides, it was considered a tie. And that was the closest thing to a victory for the Union because the Union was looking for anything. And Lincoln took advantage of this situation and he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation said that all slaves were freed below the Mason-Dixon line. So he said they were free in the rebelling states. That doesn't free the slaves that are in the territories or in the northern states that still believed in slavery because he didn't want to get rid of those border states. So that caused a lot of issues, and we'll talk about those next note set.